Hey, welcome along. Today we're unpacking problematic positionality. And if that works, for our next show, we'll be unpositioning problematic packanality. Who talks like this? Well, our so-called, quote, educators at institutions of higher learning around the Western world, which is what I want to talk about today. But I will, before I set up this case specifically, I just want to, because I'm a little late getting to this, but I want to say a word about it because it's personal to me. 10 years ago, a decade ago, time goes by very quickly, I fought a long, hard battle for free speech in Canada when the Canadian Islamic Congress effectively attempted to criminalize my writing by filing 3 complaints with 3 separate human rights commissions. And that sounds like a kind of joke when you put it like that, human rights commissions. In fact, they have extraordinary powers. If we'd lost in the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal, I would have faced a lifetime publication ban in the land of my birth on all the subjects that they'd complained about, which is to say Islam, Europe, the war on terror, demography. In theory, just applying to Maclean's, my magazine in Canada at that time. But obviously, if you've been found to be in breach of the law and Maclean's can't publish you on Islam or demography or Europe, then there's no reason why the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail would want to try publishing you. So I could still, in theory, have served as, say, ballet critic for Maclean's, at least until the Royal Winnipeg Ballet attempted to offer Jihad the Ballet for its Christmas season. Then I would have had to recuse myself. And that judgment would have had the force of a Supreme Court decision in British Columbia. So it wasn't a small thing. But we fought back, and I was backed by Maclean's and Rogers Publishing, and they fought that case. And Julian Porter, a terrific QC, that's Queen's Counsel in the Commonwealth, and in America it translates to numero uno hotshot trial attorney. I think I've translated it into American accurately. And we won, and eventually Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Code, which was a gross restraint on freedom of speech and an absolutely repugnant law to any country in the English tradition, was repealed. And that was a hard-fought battle, and I was pretty exhausted at the end of it, and I thought I'd kind of rest on my laurels for a bit. Because you think you've won a pretty big victory. I mean, not many people actually succeed in getting laws repealed. That was quite a big consequence of that case. And it was a modest victory for freedom of speech. But you turn your back for a moment, and the whole totalitarian thought police who are opposed to freedom of speech is back at work, essentially attempting to criminalize opinion. The left no longer pays even theoretical lip service to that apocryphal bit of Voltaire, that I disagree with what you say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it. Now they disagree with what you have to say, but they will fight to the death, not to have to put up with one little tweet or Facebook post or anything exposing them to other points of view. And I'm like an old guy, you know, when I took that stand with Ken White, my publisher at Maclean's, and we were like, our best years are behind, let's face it, you know, our best years are behind us, we're done. So we could afford to take a big heroic stand. And I want to say a word today about Lindsay Shepherd. She's 22, and she has her whole life ahead of her. And she is a genuine hero for what she has exposed at Wilfrid Laurier University, which is a university 99.99% of you will never have heard of, but it's in Ontario somewhere. In the Kitchener-Waterloo area, I think. I'm surprised you can still have towns named Kitchener and Waterloo in Ontario. That's a hate crime all by itself. But there's a university there called Wilfrid Laurier University. And if you're wondering who's Wilfrid Laurier, well, Sir Wilfrid Laurier was the first Francophone Prime Minister of Canada, and he's the guy who famously said a little over a century ago that just as the 19th century had belonged to the United States, So the 20th century would belong to Canada. And it didn't quite work out like that. But if we're not careful, the 21st century will belong to the likes of Wilfrid Laurier University and the totalitarian control freaks who infest that university and other universities throughout the Western world. Lindsay Shepherd is a 22-year-old teaching assistant there, and she was summoned before a troika. I think that's the appropriate word. I had a troika of commissars, as I called them, in the British Columbia Superior Court, the Robson Street Courthouse, when the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal eventually sat and heard the Maclean's case. It's always a troika these days, isn't it? In this case, the troika were two fellas called Nathan Rambukkana and Herbert Pimlott. Nathan and Herbert are words that names I used to associate with solid, substantial men, as Ira Gershwin once put it. But Nathan Rambukkana and Herbert Pimlott are both professors in the Department of Communication Studies at this university, which is odd as neither of them seems actually able to communicate. And also joining them in the troika is Adria Joel, whose job title is Manager of Gendered Violence Prevention and Support. Yes, that's a job at Wilfrid Laurier University. And they summoned her and because she had committed a crime. And Lindsay Shepherd was not informed of actually what crime it was she had committed. So it's just like if you've read Franz Kafka, if you read Milan Kundera's great novel of post-war Czechoslovakia about a student who makes one joke and his entire life is ruined. You'll know you'll be familiar. These are the kind of scenarios we used to have in post-war Eastern Europe, in communist societies, and now they're coming true in the Western world. This troika of commissars summon Lindsay Shepherd and wish to interrogate her about the crime she's committed, even though she can't know what the crime is and can't know who accused her of the crime. So we have a very Soviet situation here. And the crime was that the crime was presented in the Canadian papers as if she'd played a video of Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson was a guest on the Mark Steyn show a couple of months back. It's a terrific interview. It's out there on the internet. I asked him the big question, is the jig up for Western civilization? And Jordan Peterson's big thing of the moment, what catapulted him to celebrity in Canada, was this use of pronoun misgendering, which arises out of the transgender rights issue. And just to put that to one side, I take a relaxed view of these things. I like humanity in all its grand variety. If a man wishes to live as a woman or a woman wishes to live as a man, go for it. Have at it. Best of luck to you. I feel slightly differently about the urge to get people into gender transitioning when they're still in grade school, which I think is evil and child abuse. And I think it's very different when the state gets involved and the state actually enforces correct attitudes on these things. When officialdom enforces correct attitudes on these things. And that's Dr. Peterson's concern too. So, for example, there are no longer two sexes, there are multiple genders. And if you don't use the right pronoun, you're in big trouble. So this was presented in the media that Lindsay Shepherd had played a Jordan Peterson video. In fact, that's not what happened. She played 5 minutes of a clip from a show called The Agenda, which is on public television in Ontario. It's the Ontario equivalent, in effect, of, I was going to say the Charlie Rose show, but now he's staggering around without his pants on. That's probably not the comparison that Steve Paikin, the host of The Agenda, wishes to hear. At any rate, if you can imagine Charlie Rose before he took his pants off, that's what this show was. It's impeccable, slightly somnolent public television. I was on it. at the time of my free speech battles. And as usual, the duplicitous buggers tried to stitch me up. I discovered on the day of the show that they were going to interview me and then interview the 3 Muslim complainants against me, who would then demolish everything I said without giving me a chance to respond. And as is my wont, you can find this on the internet too. I think the guy won an award for the show, which is great. Worked out swell for him, being devious and tricky towards your guests. I demanded that we actually have a face-to-face discussion. And Steve Paikin responded that we didn't have enough chairs, and I yelled at him, "It's not a chair issue." One of the great lines of Canadian television. I think it's a fascinating story, and I would love to talk about it. If these guys who are sitting over here and don't want to talk about it I don't understand. They've been asking for a debate for 4 or 5 months.
Well,
I'd be happy to have a debate. Come on over, guys. I'm here.
Mark,
I'm here to debate. I'm only in Toronto once every couple of years. Come on over, have the debate.
Obviously, there are no chairs over here.
Well, come on.
Over there.
It's not a chair issue.
Just a minute. The chairs are over there. Just a minute.
I'll go over there. Yeah.
I'm going to ask.
Huh?
Stand by.
Okay.
Michael, roll some tape. Get me over there, and I'll be right back.
So the agenda is as boringly respectable Canadian public television as you can get. And for playing a 5-minute clip of it, including Dr. Jordan Peterson debating a fellow professor, Lindsay Shepherd was hauled up before this troika of commissars. And I was glad to see that Steve Paikin, the host of the agenda, actually complained how astonished he was at being compared by this Inquisition to Hitler. And so his Charlie Rose with trousers type TV show is being compared to like playing a speech by Hitler. You don't believe me? This is what the Inquisitors actually say.
This is basically like playing, not to kind of do the thing where everything is kind of compared to Hitler, but this is like neutrally playing a speech by Hitler or Milo Yiannopoulos from Gamergate.
That's a great line, isn't it? This is like neutrally playing a speech by Hitler or Milo Yiannopoulos. Hitler, Milo Yiannopoulos, the 2 great bogeymen of the age to this particular Inquisition. And the agenda, Steve Paikin, astonished at being compared to Adolf Hitler. But these guys don't know anybody but Hitler. Hitler and Milo Yiannopoulos. That's all you need. If you do anything they disagree with, you're not just Hitler, you're Milo Yiannopoulos with worse hair. You're Hitler without the moustache. These guys actually can't argue. They're professors in the communications department, but as they grill Lindsay Shepherd, they're not actually capable of communicating. They say things like, this is a problematic idea that we might want to that we might want to unpack, because those are things we're responsible for not impacting. They say, I understand your positionality.
So I understand the position that you're coming from and your positionality, but the reality is that it has created a toxic climate.
That's the sort of thing these guys say to make themselves sound more authoritative. And Lindsay Shepherd, as I said, she's a 22-year-old young woman, and she pushes back. But listen to this. Listen to this part here.
But when they leave the university, they're going to be exposed to these ideas. So I don't see how I'm doing a disservice to the class by exposing them to ideas that are really out there. And I'm sorry I'm crying. I'm stressed out because this to me is so wrong. It's so wrong.
Can you hear this? She's apologizing for crying. They're accusing her of being a Nazi for playing a 5-minute clip from an Ontario public TV show, which they say is analogous to Hitler or worse, Milo Yiannopoulos. So, in other words, they're accusing her of being the Nazi, while these 3 middle-aged people sit around and make a 22-year-old woman cry. You know, who's the Nazi here? As I said, I didn't much care for the troubles I had up in Canada, but, you know, I've had a pretty good life, and if it's over, so be it. They were prepared to ruin the life of a 22-year-old woman for playing a clip from a public affairs show in Canada. They can't argue. All they can do is use labels, throw around names, like frogs on a lily pond. They hop from white supremacist to climate denier to big tobacco to big pharma to big oil. In other words, you're 22 years old and you make one misstep and suddenly the known world dissolves and you're some sort of climate denying white supremacist tobacco executive in their eyes. These people lie. Listen to this.
This is actually, these arguments are counter to the Canadian Human Rights Code. Ever since, and I know that you talked about C-16, ever since this passed, it is discriminatory to be targeting someone due to their gender identity or gender expression.
Those arguments are contrary to the Canadian Human Rights Code. That's something that's not up for debate because of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They're accusing her of breaking the law. There's nothing in the Canadian Human Rights Code or the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that says you can't play a 5-minute clip from public television in a university class. So these guys are lying. They're abusing. They're actually abusing this woman. They're making it. They're not staggering around trouserless like Charlie Rose, but they are in effect doing the same thing. They're abusing the woman. Listen to her sobbing here.
And I'm sorry I'm crying. I'm stressed out because this to me is so wrong. It's so wrong.
She has no idea what crime she's committed, and eventually they ask what crime she's committed. And I want to make sure I get this, I get the name. Oh yeah, gender-based violence, explains the manager of gendered violence prevention and support. This woman, for playing a 5-minute clip from a public affairs program, is guilty of gender-based violence, causing harm to trans students by bringing their pronouns as invalid. Right? Again, this is how people in the communications department talk. Causing harm to trans students by bringing their pronouns as invalid. And she's sobbing. She doesn't know what they're talking about. The one guy says, oh, the Nazis actually used issues around free speech. No, they didn't. In fact, the Weimar Republic. I testified to the House of Commons in Canada on this very matter when an opposition MP mused on whether it wouldn't have been better to prohibit the publication of Mein Kampf. And I said, actually, let's run the tape of that. This is me explaining to the guy in the House of Commons in Ottawa why, in fact, the Weimar Republic had laws explicitly against free speech to get the Nazis.
Well, the problem with that analysis, I think, which sounds as if it ought to be right, that there are sometimes things that are so terrible that you can't let them sit out there, is that the Weimar Republic, Germany for the 12 years before the Nazi Party came to power, had its own version of Section 13 and equivalent laws. It was very much a kind of proto-Canada in terms of its hate speech laws. The Nazi Party had 200 prosecutions brought against them for anti-Semitic speech. At one point, the state of Bavaria issued an order banning Hitler from giving public speeches, and all it did, as Ezra said, was to glamorize him, to make him a hero. What is it he's saying that is so dangerous the state won't permit him to say it? If Hitler came back today, I don't know where he is, he's 128 years old, living in the South American jungles or wherever he is, but if he came back today, he would be laughing his head off at anti-Holocaust Holocaust denial laws in Europe, because it would show that his ideas still had power, that they were still powerful and still dangerous. The lesson we should learn from Germany is that for the 12 years before he came to power, it had all the hate speech laws, it had all the Section 13 laws in the world, and it did nothing but glamorize Adolf Hitler and the Nazis and facilitate his rise to power.
And a fat lot of good all that did, didn't it? In other words, If you defeat bad ideas in the open air, when you attempt to criminalize speech, criminalize opinion, it doesn't work. That goes for the Weimar Republic, and it goes for the Western world today. This young woman, it's impossible. I urge you, there's a lot of boring stuff in this 40-minute audio tape because there's just the showboating, know-nothing professor droning on about peer review for 15 minutes in the middle of it. But I would urge you to listen to it because what this young woman is talking about and what they are doing to her is the way the academy is going. They don't see her as someone they have a difference of opinion with. They see her as a wicked person. They see her as an evil person. And it's only because she took the precaution of secretly recording the Inquisition that she managed to survive the punishment they wished to inflict on her. Good for Lindsay. Good for a 22-year-old woman who's actually the biggest man in the room there. The only one who is actually not engaged in an act of evil, totalitarian thought control. The only one who respects her fellow human beings enough to think that they're capable of addressing different subjects and different points of view on those subjects. The only man in the room with these three court eunuchs of the totalitarian state. She never found out who her accuser was. It's a basic premise. Well, two things on this. First, it was a secret trial. It was meant to be a secret trial, which is disgusting. In Canada or England or Australia or anywhere else within the English legal tradition. So good for her for taping it. She never got to confront her accuser. She had no idea whether one person or 10 people or 30 people complained. Because apparently not only were the names of the accusers confidential, so were the number. So it could be just one. Given that these people are either liars or exceptionally stupid, I would bet on the lower end of that figure. But the line that stays with me the most is a line that came up in the Inquisition that kind of kicked off my own free speech battles in Canada a decade ago, when an Alberta human rights commissar breezily said to Ezra Levant, the publisher of the Western Standard, you're entitled to your opinion. And they do the same thing here.
You're perfectly welcome to your own opinions, but when you're bringing it into the context of the classroom, that can become problematic.
You're perfectly welcome to your own opinions. No, she's not. If she were welcome to her own opinions, she wouldn't be hauled up before this Inquisition. They come back to it about 20 minutes later.
You know, they can believe what they say, they can say what they believe, right? Everyone's entitled to their opinions. But
everyone's entitled to their opinions. No. This Inquisition is taking place because in Canada and in universities around the Western world, increasingly you are not entitled to your own opinion. There is a correct opinion, and you are not free to choose whether or not you take that opinion. Whether or not you agree with it, whether or not you disagree with it, you are obliged to sign on to it. It's the correct position. As these professors say about almost everything that arises, that's not up for debate. That's not up for debate. That's not up for debate. I can't think of, unlike America, Canadian universities aren't a shakedown operation. Depending on where you're born, you can go to some of these universities for a couple of grand. It's not a huge six-figure sum that's going to wreck your finances for most of your working life, as it is in the United States. So at least in Canada, you can get brainwashed for bargain basement prices. But the fact is, brainwashing is still what it is. And the fact is, whether you're giving $200,000 or $2,000 to these men, let's restate their names, Professor Nathan Rambukkana and Professor Herbert Pimlott. If you give money to these guys, you're wasting your money. These guys are not scholars. They're not in the education business. They're in the social engineering business. They're in the social justice so-called business. And if you listen to this tape, their willingness to wreck the life of a 22-year-old woman who has done nothing wrong except play a short clip from a boring Ontario public affairs show embodies the decay and decadence of the academy in North America and throughout the rest of the Western world. I found it exhausting to fight that battle 10 years ago, just to get one little rinky-dink piece of that disreputable human rights code removed. And then as soon as it's gone, everyone's legislating to try and put something back there in its place. And one thing I noticed is that you're up against all the respectable people, all the hack bureaucrats, the so-called conservative attorney general who doesn't want to actually take a stand for individual liberty. All the people you're up against, they've got all the baubles the Canadian state can give them. They're in the Order of Canada, they've got the Queen's Jubilee Medal, they got the whole lot. This young woman, Lindsay Shepherd, I don't know whether she'll ever end up in the Order of Canada or get the Queen's Jubilee Medal or anything else, but she ought to, because she's a genuine Canadian hero. And she forced this university to back down, issue a grudging apology only because she'd shamed them in public. And that's the point to remember. These totalitarian thugs and what they do cannot withstand the scrutiny of daylight. Everybody who finds themselves in Lindsay Shepherd's position should do what Lindsay Shepherd did. Record it, expose it. 3 middle-aged men charging two middle-aged men and a middle-aged woman charging a 22-year-old woman with a crime they cannot state at the behest of plaintiffs they will not name, and convicting her of essentially guilt by association. And she sobs at various points through this inquisition. And the guys who make the 22-year-old young lady sob are telling her that she's the Nazi. That's a Canadian university in the year 2017. The 21st century will not be the century of Wilfrid Laurier University, and it will be thanks to brave, genuine Canadian heroes like Lindsay Shepherd.
I don't feel the need to shield people from what's going on in society. Like,
Okay.
to imagine that this is happening in university, it's just bad.